The first subject we're going to cover is building science. In this particular session, we're going to talk about identifying building components and systems as they relate to energy efficiency. So that's what I talked about a little bit earlier. We're going to change your perspective about building components so we can see them from an energy efficiency perspective. We're going to talk about thermodynamics. It's not getting into a physics class, but we're going to talk about some of the basic concepts of thermodynamics and how that relates to energy efficiency. We're going to talk about building science, what it is. It's the study of how all systems of a structure function together to optimize or minimize building performance and prevent or cause building failure. When I'm talking about building failure, what am I talking about? Am I talking about a building falling down? Well, if a building falls down, that's certainly building failure, right? But what else am I talking about? Okay, we're talking about loss of energy. What else are we talking about? Loss of function, right? So if the roof leaks, the building has failed, right? But why are we inside a building anyway? To stay warm and stay dry, shelter, right? So if we're inside a building and we're cold and we're wet, what do we say about that building? That building has failed, hasn't it? Let's say we're inside that building, we're dry and we're warm, but our wallet is empty because our bill isn't so high, so incredibly high. Has that building failed us?
Yes.
Yes, because we're also supposed to be comfortable inside that building. Comfort, right, is about being dry. It's about being the right temperature we want to be. So let's talk about building performance. What is building performance? Building performance is a measurable set of building characteristics. For example, durability. How long will the building last? The longer the building lasts, the higher performing the building is. Does that make sense? Moisture management. Remember we said that it's important when we're inside that we're dry. So how well does the building manage moisture? Both moisture that's generated inside the building and moisture that comes from outside the building. Energy efficiency. This one is pretty self-explanatory. How well does a building use energy? Or how much does it waste energy? Indoor air quality. Now this is a big one. Once upon a time, we heard about that fibrous stuff. What's that called? Asbestos, right? Woo, asbestos, bad news, right? Want to stay away from asbestos. Now what's everybody worried about? Mold, microbial contamination. If your building facilitates the growth of mold, what do we say about that building? That building has failed, right? Structural performance. This goes back to, will the building stand up? Okay, we get 3 feet of snow. Is the building going to collapse on top of us? If the structure doesn't manage the structural performance, isn't good. Thermal comfort, warm and dry. Thermal comfort is just exactly that, right? So what's the beauty of energy efficiency is that not only do we save the homeowner money, we can make the homeowner more comfortable. That's pretty cool, right? I can save you money and make your house more luxurious. Granite countertops can't do that. So now let's talk about energy and power. What is energy? Energy is the measurable quantity of heat, light, or work. For example, energy can be measured in things like BTUs of heat, kilowatt hours of electricity, or barrels of oil. Power, on the other hand, is energy being used over time. For example, you have BTU hours, kilowatts, horsepower. Energy, measurable quantity, heat, light, or work. Power is energy used over time. Let's talk about a light bulb, 60-watt light bulb, and a stick of dynamite. You like that? Did you know that a stick of dynamite uses the same amount of energy as a 60-watt light bulb uses in about 4.5 hours? What's the difference? The stick of dynamite uses that same amount of energy in 4 billionths of a second. Consequently, it's a lot more powerful than the light bulb when it comes to energy versus power, the measurements. Power is simply energy used over time. I'll give you another example. We have a smart car and a Corvette. The smart car and the Corvette can both do 70 miles an hour, but the Corvette will get there faster to 70 miles an hour, right? It also burns more gas along the way to do that. We talked about barrels of oil or gallons of gasoline. We use more gasoline in less time in the more powerful car. Joules per second, right? Power is energy over time. When I say watt, what does that take into consideration? Watt has a time element built into it. So if we want to go to a unit of energy, we have to take the time component out. So what do? We multiply it by hour, right? Because we have kilowatt hour. So we take a unit of time and a unit of time and they cancel each other out. Time over time equals 1. And as a result, we end up with kilowatt hours or kilojoules. The reason why I mention that is because when you're talking to a homeowner, you're going to be talking about kilowatt hours and you're going to be talking about therms, which are both units of energy. How many therms did you use? How many kilowatt hours of energy did you use? If you start talking to a homeowner about kilowatts and they know something about energy and power, what happens to your credibility? Your credibility starts to go into the toilet because the homeowner starts thinking, you know, kilowatts, that's a unit of power. What's he talking about? You have a 1,000 kilowatt microwave. That's how powerful your microwave is. 1,500 kilowatts. Let's start talking about thermodynamics. These are 4 rules of thermodynamics. The first rule is energy is constant. It cannot be created or destroyed. It simply is converted from one form to another. Heat is a form of energy transfer. Point 4, this is one of the points that's most important for you to understand, and that's the concept of entropy. Entropy, in layman's terms, simply means hot goes to cold. Hot goes to cold, never the other way around. So in the universe, everything is trying to arrive at an equilibrium, and that is also true of heat. Warm things are trying to warm cool things until they both equal the same temperature. So we always have warm things warming cold things, never the other way around. Understand how this works. Heat is molecules, basically molecules vibrating, and they're bouncing off each other. And every time one molecule, a warmer molecule is more excited, right? It's got more kinetic energy than the rest. And every time it hits another molecule, a cooler molecule that's vibrating not as much, it gives up some of its energy. Take, for example, a car. If Rusty's car was parked out here on 35th, will that car start rolling away all by itself? No. That car will sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there and sit there until what happens? Until it gets some energy. Now, if a big truck comes by and runs into the back of Rusty's car, will it move? Yes. Oh yeah, it will move. Right? And that's because it starts to move because the energy of the truck is transferred to the car. Consequently, the car starts to move. Cold molecules will not warm themselves on their own. They're only warmed if we warm them. Why do I make this distinction? Why is this a big deal for you as energy efficiency folks? We heat our spaces, we know where the heat is, and the heat's trying to go someplace else. So we're not trying to keep the cold out, we're trying to keep the heat in. And that changes the way we think about and the techniques that we use to do that. Think about this with the car, okay? If the car could move on its own, then we'd chain down the car, right? But if the car can't move unless something hits it, then we put up barriers around the car. You understand how that changes what we do? Now, mind you, if we put barriers around the car, it would stop the car from moving even if it started to move, right? But if we're trying to stop something from hitting it, it changes the methods that we use and how we think about things. Okay, let's look at some more rules of thermodynamics. Any questions on these 4 rules of thermodynamics? Hot goes to cold. Okay, very good. Never the other way around. Warm air rises. However, heat goes in all directions. So heat doesn't rise. Heat goes in all directions. Warm air rises. And because warm air rises, cold air sinks. Air, like me, is lazy. And as you would imagine, a lazy person or a lazy air is going to take the path of least resistance. Air prefers the big hole over the small hole, least resistance. So the reason why we're concerned about that is when we're going around a house and we're trying to seal up air leaks. What kind of air leaks are we looking for? The big ones, right? We want to plug the big leaks before we start messing around with the small leaks, because the big leaks will give us more bang for our buck than the small leaks. This one's like entropy. Wet goes to dry. So dry things don't make wet things dry. Wet things make dry things wet. How does this transfer into being a building analyst? Remember we said one of our building performance measurements is moisture management. We're managing the moisture. We're not managing the dry. We keep dry things dry by managing the moisture. We don't manage the dry. Wet goes to dry. Okay, let's start talking about thermal comfort. What is comfort? People are different, right? Some people, like me, I like a nice cool day or cool evening by a nice warm fireplace. That's what I like. Other people, they like a blistering hot day with a cool breeze by a pool. Some people like a cold drink on a hot day. Some people like a warm drink on a cold day. So our folks at ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating and Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers, they came up with a definition of thermal comfort. Human thermal comfort is defined by ASHRAE as the state of mind that expresses satisfaction with the surrounding environment. Let me translate that into English for you. People think is comfortable what they find comfortable. Again, as building analysts, why do we care? Why is this definition important to us? So let's say we walk into a house, and the first thing we think to ourselves is, wow, it's hot in here. And we look over on the couch, and there's a little old lady under the blanket. Sir, it's really cold in here. Can you help? You understand the concept of thermal comfort? Okay. As the building analyst, our comfort is irrelevant because it's not our house. It's not our building, right? We're not the building occupant. So if they've got a lot of thermal loss, like David mentioned, and they're in shorts and t-shirt, got their thermostat set at 80 so they can be comfortable, that's relevant to us. Because now we need to figure out how can we get this guy or lady running around in t-shirt and shorts to be comfortable in the house they're in. That's why thermal comfort is relevant to you, because that's what we're trying to achieve as building analysts. We're trying to achieve, one of the things we're trying to achieve is having the building occupant be comfortable. Let's talk about some of the factors that contribute to thermal comfort. Air temperature, air velocity, radiant temperature, humidity, metabolic heat, clothing, and insulation, okay? These are the 6 factors that contribute to thermal comfort. So we'll talk about each one of these in turn and what do they do? How do they contribute to thermal comfort? The first one we're going to talk about is air temperature. So air temperature is a measurement of the vibrating molecules in the air. We talked about that a little bit ago. So that is air temperature. We usually measure air temperature either in Fahrenheit or Celsius, and air temperature actually impacts relative humidity. Now, air temperature is important to thermal comfort, very, very important, although it's not the primary factor that determines thermal comfort. That's actually radiant temperature. Give me an example of radiant temperature or sources of radiant heat. A radiator. So we have like a radiator, the old-fashioned radiator. What else? The human body, radiating heat. Stovetop, the sun, baseboard heaters. Radiant heat, right, is thermal radiation that radiates from an object. We talked about hot air rises, but heat goes in all directions. That's radiant heat. Radiant temperature has the greatest influence on a person, even greater than air temperature. Radiant temperature influences the loss or gain of heat. And I'll give you an example. The same example, okay? So Rusty. So Rusty goes out of his house on a, let's not say a cold day, but let's say a cool day. It's in the mid-50s, but it's perfectly clear and the sun is beating down on Rusty. And Rusty feels comfortable even though the air is very, very cool because of that radiant temperature. Now, Rusty on a summer day is sitting inside his air-conditioned house in front of the window, and the sun's beating on the back of his neck. And beads of sweat are coming down his forehead. Do you see how the radiant temperature has a greater influence over you than the air temperature? So that's also important for us to keep in mind as building analysts. Somebody says they're always hot or they're always cold. What's happening around them? Are they sitting in front of the window? Human body radiates and absorbs heat depending on what's happening around us. Let's talk about air velocity and how that affects human thermal comfort. Air velocity is simply the speed of air moving. So even low velocity may be perceived as a draft. Now, on the converse side, still or stagnant air in an indoor environment can cause people to feel stuffy. Now, you guys have no doubt heard of this concept of sick building syndrome. Okay, not enough air moving. I'll tell you a story. I was doing an audit in a house. This is Boulder. It's about 50 degrees. So I walk up to the homeowner's house. It's about 9 o'clock in the morning. Homeowner opens the door. The first thing I notice as I look over his shoulder is back in the back of his house, he's got his windows open and his sliding glass door open. It's 50 degrees outside. And he just called me to do an energy audit on his house. That's odd. Okay. So, we start doing the audit. Go through the audit. We run the blower door test. Okay. Now, BPI recommends, when we talk about this thing called natural air changes per hour, that is how many times the air in your house changes over under natural conditions. How much does your building leak? Okay? BPI recommends a 0.35, which is 35% of the air in your house should be exchanged every hour in order for your house to feel comfortable. That was the reading I got on his house. 0.08. So I asked him, Does your house tend to feel stuffy? Oh, my goodness. He launches into a 20-minute story about how, well, you know, at night he goes to bed after his wife, and so his wife goes downstairs and opens the windows for his kids, and then 2 hours later when he goes to bed, he goes downstairs and he shuts them, and they have this whole routine of opening and closing doors and windows and doors and windows in order to keep their house from being stuffy. And through their habits, they change that 0.08 to a 0.35 just by opening and closing windows. Not having enough air moving through a building is just as much of a problem as having too much air. That air that they're opening up and letting out, they had to pay for that air. They had to pay to heat that air or pay to cool that air, and now they are just letting it out. They have to. They have to be so that they can get fresh air in the house. Air velocity from forced air systems is often a problem. Okay? You ever been to a restaurant and you get sit at the wrong table? Okay? Everything's comfortable except that there's cold air blowing over the top of your head. Okay? So that's a factor that contributes to your comfort level. Something else about air velocity. When air is moving across you, are you familiar with what's actually happening that creates that feeling of coolness? If you think about this, right, almost like a wetsuit. If you've got a wetsuit on, right, it's got a layer of water in between, and you radiate heat, and that water warms up to the same temperature as you, but that water isn't allowed to leave its proximity around your skin. Consequently, you can be in cold water and feel warm. Well, same thing happens with air. If you're sitting in stagnant air, you're warming that air, and warm air rises. So there's a natural convective process air's being replaced by cooler air next to your skin. But that process happens fairly slowly. But take a fan or air and start blowing that across your skin. And now that air that you've been warming up is now constantly being replaced with cooler air. Add perspiration to that and the evaporating that's happening, and now you can take air that is actually warmer than you and use it to cool your skin. Because we know that ceiling fans don't cool air, right? Fans don't cool air. But they work because they circulate air and they blow air across us, and it creates this or facilitates this evaporative process. Humidity. Humidity is the amount of moisture or water vapor in the air. Relative humidity is the amount of water in the air relative to the amount of water the air could hold, measured in percentage. Okay? Relative humidity is the amount of water in the air relative to the amount of water that the air could hold. As the temperature of air goes up, the amount of water it can hold also goes up. We have a bucket. Let's say we have a 5-gallon bucket. In that 5-gallon bucket is 2.5 gallons of water. How full is that bucket? 50%. Let's say that bucket gets smaller. Now that bucket is only 2.5 gallons. How full is that bucket? 100%. What happens to this bucket if it gets smaller? Water's going to start spilling out over the side, right? We're talking about the bucket. We're making the comparison that the bucket is the temperature of the air, and the water inside of it is the amount of moisture in the air, and how full the bucket is the relative humidity. Okay? So, getting to condensation. So, as temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down. and vice versa. As temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up. So as the temperature drops, we hit 100% relative humidity. The air cannot hold water anymore. It has to give it up. It has to give up the excess, and we get condensation. Or we get rain, or we get snow. Okay? But condensation, that's what happens inside of a house, on windows, on the roof of a bathroom. Okay? That's what's happening. One of two things, usually one of two things. In a bathroom, what's happening is we keep adding moisture to the water, or moisture to the air. We keep adding moisture to the air, and the air gets saturated based on its temperature, and consequently, it begins to condensate on the colder surfaces, which are the ceiling and the walls and the mirror humidity. As temperature goes up, relative humidity goes down. As temperature goes down, relative humidity goes up.
So it's the opposite.
It's the opposite. Humidity contributes to human comfort because it facilitates or inhibits the evaporation of perspiration. Does that make sense? So here in Colorado, we have relatively low humidity. On a hot day, you go for a run or you get outside and you start perspiring, and that perspiration starts to evaporate, and, you know, we're okay. Now, go to Louisiana, where the relative humidity is very high. And now you start to sweat, and all you end up with is soaked clothes. And you're still hot and you're still miserable. Because the relative humidity is so high, it doesn't facilitate the evaporation of your perspiration. Okay? Same thing can happen inside of a house. Sometimes you'll find folks from higher humid climates, and when they get into their house, they like their house humid because it's good for their skin, right? They're used to that. That's what they're comfortable with. What's unique about these last two factors, clothing and body metabolism? These are two things that the homeowner has direct influence over. The building occupant has direct control, or the most influence anyway, over these two things, the clothing and the metabolism. Body metabolism impacts the amount of heat produced by the body. Okay, somebody with a fast metabolism generates more heat than somebody with a slow metabolism. These two factors you need to be particularly careful about. Okay, we want to be, when we get into the homeowners, the building, we're talking to the building occupant, we want to be very careful about what we say about these two factors. However, we want to definitely keep those factors in mind when we're doing our investigation into issues going on with the house. Clothing, like body metabolism, impacts how much heat is retained by the body. So our metabolism, that's how much energy is being generated. Our clothing is how much of that energy we retain. We can walk into a homeowner's house and we can say, oh, you're cold, you need to wear more clothes. But is that really the solution? The house can still be failing, right? Wouldn't it be better if we could insulate the house, keep more of the heat in the house to begin with, so that they can not run their heater as much, and they can walk around in their house in whatever they feel comfortable wearing?
Yes.
That's better. Then again, I mean, going back to building performance, isn't that why you live inside in the first place?
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Okay? So, keeping that in mind, what are they wearing? Why are they wearing it? What are they trying to accomplish? Now, mind you, if they've got fully insulated house, right, and it's sealed up tight, and they have their thermostat set at 58 degrees, and they're wearing a heavy jacket, and they're saying, I'm cold, okay? Then there may be a little bit of education that you need to do there, okay? So, but each customer is different. When you take all of these factors and bring all of these factors together, those factors together will determine whether or not your building occupant is comfortable. And when you go and you do your investigation, when you do your analysis of the structure, and you're looking at those 5, 6 components, those are going to talk to you. Those are going to influence what you do to make the homeowner more comfortable. Let's talk about heat flow. For some reason, I love this picture because I think it illustrates very, very well the 4 different ways that a building loses energy. Actually, this picture only illustrates 3, but there's 4 different ways a building loses energy. Conduction, convection, and radiation. Let's talk about conduction. Conduction. In order to have conduction, you must have contact. Conduction is heat moving through a solid material, like drywall, studs, sheeting. What do we use to keep our hands from getting burned when we grab a hot pot? A hot pad, glove. What's that's a fancy name for what? Insulation. That's what we use to break the heat transfer. If we grab a hot pot without some kind of insulation, we experience conduction. So a building is the same way. In order to prevent conduction from happening in a building, we have to have what's called a thermal break. And that thermal break is usually made out of some kind of insulating material. In a house, conduction happens in the framing. It happens in the foundation, and it happens in doors and windows. Convection is heat moving through a fluid. So in this particular case, we have radiation from the fire, which warms up the air. Then that air rises, and that's why he's got his hands up above. You're being warmed by that air fluid. Radiation, you see he's got his hands out to the side, right? So we still have radiation coming off the fire, even though the warm air is going up if you have an open fire. You understand the concept. So when you put your hands above the fire, you're getting both, technically. You're getting the convection of the warm air coming up, but you're also getting radiation off the fire because heat goes in all directions, including up. Convection, that's the bulk movement of thermal energy or heat through a fluid. When you think about this, you look at this pot, right? So we have a pot full of water, we set it on the stove. And that stove starts heating the bottom of the pot. And what happens? The water on the bottom of that pot starts to warm. And so, just like warm air, warm water rises. As that warm water rises, it's replaced with cooler water from the top of the pot. Then, as that water begins to be warmed, it becomes warmer than the water that we warmed originally, and now that water falls back down to the bottom of the pot. It gets warm, falls back to the bottom, gets warm, falls back to the bottom. What geometric figure am I making? Circle. A circle, right? That's how convection tends to move in a circle. The same thing happens in a house. We have a radiator, and our radiator warms the heat, warms the air. That warm air rises to the top of the room and begins to cool off. When it gets to the top of the room, it falls down to the floor, travels along the floor to the radiator where it gets warmed yet again. Okay, that's a radiator system. If we have a forced air system, it's the same thing. Our registers tend to be down low, so we introduce air into the room, it's warm, it gets cooler, comes down to the floor, travels along the floor, and then gets vacuumed in at the returns. This natural movement of air in a room allows us to evenly distribute air, warm air, throughout the room. It's a good thing, okay? Because we warm up air over here, but I can warm that part of the room over there, back where Damien is, because that warm air will then travel along the ceiling until it begins to cool and falls on the top of Damien's head, but it's still warmer than the air that's at his feet, which is making its way back over to me to be reheated, okay? That's a good thing. That's a convective loop. That's a good thing. Sometimes convective heat loops are a bad thing. Convective heat loss is a bad thing in a hollow wall cavity because you have this same thing happening, except you're not inside the house. You're actually carrying heat from inside the house to the outside. So for example, on this slide, we have an interior of 72 degrees, but it's 20 degrees outside, and we have an empty wall cavity. So we have a sealed environment. So the air in that cavity comes over and it's up against the 72 degree side, and it gets nice and warm and cozy and begins to rise. Rises all the way up, hits that top plate, and then it comes over to this side of the wall where it's 72 degrees. And what do we know about heat? Hot goes to cold, right? So that 72 degree air that's in the wall cavity now is giving up that 72 degree heat to the 20 degree outside, right? We're trying to do global warming all by ourselves. Falls down the outside, gives up heat, Now finally at the bottom of that wall cavity, it's finally 20 degrees where it comes back over here shivering to the inside and begins to warm itself up. And it keeps doing this loop. It grabs money out of the house and it takes it over here and it dumps it outside. And it comes back over here and fills up its bucket of money and dumps it outside. It's a cycle. This is called a convective heat loop. And inside a wall cavity, it is a very, 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 very bad thing. That's how a building, even though you might have a sealed cavity, you don't have air actually leaking, this is one of the ways heat moves from inside of a building to the outside of the building. Now, let me put a caveat in here. We're talking a lot about heat loss, and that's because we live in a heating climate. We do more heating than we do cooling. But understand these same principles apply in cooling climates, where we're talking about not heat loss, but we're talking about heat gain. Because you can see this same thing happening. It's 72 degrees inside, but it's 110 degrees outside. The heat continues to move from outside to inside through this convective heat. Instead of this case, we'd call it convective heat gain instead of convective heat loss, right? But we know hot goes to cold. So this is our thought. We're trying to control the heat. We're either trying to keep the heat in or trying to keep the heat out, depending on whether we're in a heating climate or a cooling climate. The third way we transfer heat is through radiation. Again, heat goes in all directions. So radiation is heat traveling through space because we don't need there to be air or fluid or a solid for the sun's radiance to warm us on the earth. Heat going in all directions, heat traveling through space. And that heat actually may be able to penetrate certain types of materials, like glass, for example. A couple of examples of radiant heat: appliances, like a TV, light bulbs. Like if you come up here on this projector, you can feel lots of heat radiating off that light bulb. We have radiant heaters. Those three different ways that we lose heat, have heat loss. We have conduction, we have convection, and we have radiation. And your average structure will lose heat in all those three ways. If you have an empty wall cavity, through convection. If you have a window that's not well insulated, or even if it's well insulated. When we talk about windows, we'll talk about that. But we lose heat by radiation. We lose heat by conduction through our framing members. The drywall warms up, and that drywall warms up the stud, which warms up the sheeting, which warms up the siding, which then radiates that heat out into the world. What's the fourth way? It's called air leakage. And that air leakage happens primarily by this phenomenon called stack effect. Stack effect is the tendency for a building to leak, to draw cool air in at the bottom and let hot air out at the top. So when we're looking for air leaks, where's the most important place for us to start looking for air leaks? We want to look for leaks at the ceiling line. Okay, when we get into thermal envelope, we'll get into more details on that. But we're looking for leaks at this ceiling line, because if we can stop the hot air from going out in the first place, then the air won't get drawn in from the bottom. Anywhere there's a can light, that's a hole. You have things that penetrate through your ceiling line. For example, your chimney chase, right? You have exhaust vents. You have attic access hatches. You have ceiling fixtures of other sort, right? In order to have a light fixture on the ceiling, you had to cut a hole in that ceiling to put that junction box in, right? Now, the electrician probably didn't, but when the house was brand new, the electrician put the junction box up there, and the drywall guys came through and they cut a hole for that junction box. We insulate our attic. That's important. But we're talking about air leak, right? We want to make the ceiling so that as if it has no holes in it at all. We were talking about stack effect. Stack effect, which is the tendency that a building has to leak warm air at the top and pull cool air in at the bottom. To illustrate that, we have what we call our stack effect demo. It's a plastic tube. It's got some holes in it. We're heating it with a light bulb. You'll notice that it's pulling that smoke in at the bottom, right? And blowing it out at the top. If we simply did this, and we sealed our top, what should happen is we should stop getting air drawn in from the bottom. See how that's not drawing in at all. So remember I said that the most important place for you to find leaks was at the ceiling line. If you can stop leaking at the ceiling line, you can stop leaking at the rim joist or at the foundation line. In a building, the lower levels, because warm air rises, so the warmest part of your house is going to be at the ceiling line. That's going to have the highest pressure. The coolest part of your house is going to be in the lower levels. That's where you're going to have the negative pressure. So you're going to have air trying to force its way out above you at the ceiling line, and that's going to create a vacuuming effect down below in your lower levels or towards your basement. Wind effect is very, very similar to the stack effect, except it's created by wind, and it tends to go in a horizontal manner. So you have wind blowing against the side of a house, and if you see in this picture the neutral power plane on this side, as you blow against, say, the right-hand side of the house in this slide, that neutral power pressure plane begins to tilt, okay? So you start to have higher pressure on the side that the wind is blowing. As the wind moves around the side of the house, it creates a negative pressure on each side, and then when it gets around the back side of the house, it's either a negative or a neutral pressure. So where the wind is blowing against the house, it's trying to blow air into the house. On the sides, that same wind is trying to suck air out of the house. And all of these effects, wind effect, stack effect, the higher the structure, the more that structure is affected by both of these effects, stack effect and wind effect. This is just a review. We talked about some of the places that your ceiling line leaks, we talked about can lights, attic hatches, chases, places where you have penetrations, light fixtures, those sorts of things. Down low, you have plumbing penetrations, like for hose bibs, places where your electrical comes into your house. This framing member that goes around your house is called the rim joist. But basically, it's the framing member that sits on top of your foundation. Let's talk about measuring air exchange. If I say that I ran a test on your house and your house is leaking 2,200 CFM of air, what does that mean to you? That information on its own is not valuable because it's only valuable relative to the volume of your house. Our blower door, this is a blower door. The blower door measures cubic feet per minute. And it does that by depressurizing, or in some rare cases, we'll pressurize a house. So we have this giant fan, we close up all the doors and windows, get the house in winter condition, we kick on that fan, and we start sucking air out of the house. And as we suck the air out of the house, we lower the pressure in the house to negative 50 Pascal, and then we maintain that, and we look at how much air is moving through the fan. Now, because we are pulling air out of the house, all the air going out of the house is going out through the fan, which means that whether you're down low or up high, we're pulling air in through every spot in your house that leaks air. We can then, either using our IR gun, tracer smoke, or our calibrated hand, go around the house and detect air leaks. That's our value of our blower door. And we'll find those air leaks at rim joists, we'll find them at the windows, we'll find them through can lights, we'll find them through, believe it or not, outlets and light switches. And then we'll get a number, so we'll get that cubic feet per minute, then we'll do a little bit of high school math, and what we'll end up with is natural air changes per hour. And really what that's telling us is what percentage of the air in the house changes over under natural conditions every hour. We're running a fan. We're depressurizing the house to negative 50 pascals. This is not natural. These are artificial conditions. So here's an example of how this works. On this house that was 40 feet by 45 foot with 8-foot ceilings and a volume of 14,400 cubic feet, we ran a blower door, and the blower door number came back 2,050 CFM. We run that through our calculation, and what that tells us is that we have an air leakage rate of 0.5 natural air changes per hour. It doesn't matter how big the house is. What's our recommended? 0.35. So would we recommend that we do air sealing in this house? Because we want to drop that 0.5 down to 0.35. Okay? So we would, in fact, recommend that we do air sealing in this house. Okay, so let's review. What ways does heat transfer through a building structure? Okay, conduction, convection, radiation, air leakage. What is stack effect? Hot air out of the top, cold air from the bottom. Wind effect, what's that? Does wind effect only affect windows? Affects every place we have a leak. Give me some rules of building science, or rules of thermodynamics, either way you want to call it. Hot goes to cold, wet goes to dry, air is lazy, warm air rises, but heat goes in all directions. Very good.